Tonight, the palace glows like heaven. Gold lamps burn along polished corridors. Incense hangs in the air. Silk whispers against marble. Somewhere beyond these walls, priests rehearse blessings for tomorrow's ceremony, and the empire prepares to watch another young woman rise into splendor. By sunrise, they will call you chosen, blessed, favored by God and destined for the highest throne in Christendom. But not in this room. Here, there is no music, no holiness, no romance, only hands. Older women circle you in silence, adjusting the fall of your veil, lifting your chin, checking your posture, the smoothness of your skin, the steadiness of your breath. One studies the way you walk. Another corrects the angle of your shoulders. A servant kneels to loosen the rings from your fingers, as if even your jewelry must be stripped of memory before you are allowed to become imperial. Tomorrow, Constantinople will see a bride wrapped in light. Tonight, the empire sees a candidate, and candidates are judged, not only for beauty, though beauty matters, not only for grace, though grace will be praised in public. They are judging something colder than that. Whether your blood is clean enough, whether your body appears strong enough, whether your face can be turned into a symbol, whether your silence will hold when the palace closes around you like a jeweled trap. Outside, the great palace blazes with ceremonial splendor. Inside, you are being prepared like an offering. By morning, history will remember the crown, the silk, the procession, the sacred hymns. It will not remember this room, the room where an imperial bride learns, before anyone dares to say it aloud, that she is not stepping into a love story. She is stepping into a machine. History likes to remember Byzantine imperial brides as if they emerged from gold and incense fully formed, lifted by destiny into sacred marriage. The mosaics show calm faces, jeweled robes, holy ceremony, and the illusion of perfect order. Everything about the image suggests beauty, blessing, and divine harmony. But empires do not choose wives the way poems do. They select for function. A Byzantine imperial bride was never just a woman entering a marriage. She was a political answer to a political problem. She had to strengthen legitimacy, protect succession, satisfy the court, and embody a vision of order vast enough to reassure an empire constantly threatened by intrigue, faction, and collapse. That is the hidden truth history usually leaves out. Before the crown came evaluation. Before the blessing came scrutiny. Before the wedding came selection, comparison, correction, and silent judgment. The empire was not simply asking who she was. It was asking what she could guarantee: an heir, stability, obedience, symbolic perfection. The splendor was real. The holiness was real. But so was the control. And that is what makes this story darker than the wedding itself. Because the imperial bride was not only being honored, she was being processed. To understand why a Byzantine imperial bride was never chosen like an ordinary noblewoman, you first have to understand what the empire expected marriage to accomplish. This was not a private union dressed in ceremony. It was a state decision dressed as sacred destiny. An emperor could not simply marry for affection, because in Byzantium, marriage at the top was never only about two people. It was about legitimacy, succession, factional balance, and the message the throne sent to every watching eye in the capital. An imperial bride did not merely enter a household. She entered the center of a state permanently afraid of disorder. Every marriage announced something. It told the court which families were rising and which were being kept at a distance. It told rivals whether the emperor sought reconciliation or tighter control. It told the church whether the union looked acceptable, pious, and politically safe. And above all, it told the empire whether the future of the dynasty might soon be secured inside the body of a single woman who had not yet spoken a word in power. That is why beauty alone was never enough. Beauty could fill a hall for one evening. The empire needed more than admiration. It needed reassurance. A bride had to appear healthy. She had to come from a family the palace could trust, tolerate, or use. Her manners had to suggest discipline. Her religious image had to be beyond easy attack. Even her silence mattered, especially her silence. In a court built on intrigue, a woman who spoke too freely could become a danger long before she wore a crown. So before she was praised in public, she had to be measured in private, not only for what she was, but for what others feared, hoped, or intended to make of her. In the Byzantine world, an empress was never merely ornamental. She could shape access, influence patronage, strengthen a faction, calm a crisis, or deepen one. She could become the mother of the next ruler. She could also become the doorway through which ambitious relatives, whispering courtiers, and hidden enemies tried to reach the throne. That was enough to make every detail of her selection feel heavier than it appeared. A smile was not just a smile, it was composure. A lowered gaze was not only modesty, it was discipline. A graceful posture was not only elegance, it suggested self-command under pressure. And scrutiny was everywhere, not only in formal ceremony, but in corridors, chapels, reception rooms, and guarded apartments where palace women, eunuchs, relatives, and court officials all formed part of the same silent machinery of observation. Before the empire presented a bride to the public, the palace wanted to know how she moved, how she listened, how she responded to correction, and whether she could survive a life in which every gesture might be interpreted as a sign of loyalty, ambition, fertility, arrogance, or weakness. This is what the polished image hides. The mosaics show serenity because serenity is what the empire wanted to display. But behind every serene imperial marriage stood a harder calculation. Could she bear heirs? Could she be shaped into ritual perfection? Could she stand beside the emperor without empowering the wrong people? Could she carry the burden of representing order in a world always one conspiracy, one coup, one burial away from rupture? A Byzantine imperial bride was not chosen because she looked radiant under candlelight. She was chosen because the empire believed it could turn her into stability. And when an empire begins to think that way, a bride stops being merely a bride. She becomes policy in silk. By the time the empire presented an imperial bride to the public, the most important decisions had already been made out of sight. That is the part history smooths away. It preserves the wedding. It preserves the purple silk, the gold embroidery, the icons, the hymns, the solemn faces lifted toward heaven. But it does not linger in the quieter rooms where a future bride was compared to other women, spoken about in lowered voices, and judged according to standards no public ceremony would ever dare to name aloud. Because before a Byzantine imperial bride could become a symbol, she had to survive selection. And selection was never innocent. At first glance, it may have looked graceful. Noble families presenting daughters, palace officials arranging introductions, court women observing with soft expressions and careful manners, eunuchs moving silently through corridors where almost nothing was said directly and almost everything was noticed. But beneath that refined surface lay a colder logic. A woman was not being admired simply for herself. She was being evaluated for usefulness. How did she carry herself when she entered a room? Did she seem calm or merely frightened? Was her beauty striking enough to impress, but not so overwhelming that it invited dangerous obsession? Did her family bring prestige or complications? Would her relatives strengthen the throne or create a second center of influence around her? Could she be instructed, corrected, contained? Those questions rarely survive in the official image, but they are there in the structure of the court itself. An imperial bride had to be more than desirable. She had to be manageable. That meant judgment reached into everything. Lineage mattered. Religious presentation mattered. Reputation mattered. Temperament mattered. The palace did not simply want a woman who could stand beside the emperor. It wanted a woman who could stand there without turning into a political hazard the moment she was crowned. So training and correction began before the wedding made anything final. Posture was watched. Speech was softened. Reactions were read. A future bride had to learn when to lower her eyes, when to remain silent, how to move through ritual without visible error, how to embody dignity without appearing independent in the wrong way. Even grace could be dangerous if it looked too self-possessed. Even intelligence could become threatening if it suggested a woman who might gather loyalties of her own. This is why the story becomes darker the closer you move toward the palace walls. The empire did not merely seek a bride. It sought predictability in human form. And that is where the beauty of the process begins to look like camouflage. A court woman adjusting a sleeve was not always just adjusting a sleeve. She was checking whether the girl fidgeted. A formal conversation was not always conversation. It was a test of restraint. A moment of silence was not emptiness. It was observation. The future bride was being studied long before anyone placed jewels on her head. Studied for signs of weakness. Studied for signs of pride. Studied for evidence that she could bear the crushing theater of empire without becoming unstable inside it. And the cruelest part is that none of this needed to look violent. That is what made it effective. No chains, no dungeon, no public humiliation, only refinement, only ritual, only correction delivered in polite tones under candlelight until a living woman was gradually pressed into the exact shape the court demanded. By the time the empire called her chosen, much of the choosing had already been done against her. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a sequence of glances, adjustments, comparisons, whispered judgments, and invisible exclusions. This is the hidden process history rarely paints. The bride enters the mosaic only after the sorting is over. Only after she has been reduced from possibility to selection. Only after the palace has looked at a human being and decided that she can be safely transformed into ceremony. When the wedding finally arrived, the empire covered everything in light. This was Byzantium's genius. It did not merely control, it sanctified control. The bride who had already been observed, corrected, and silently measured now emerged transformed before the public eye. Gold thread caught the flames of the candles. Pearls rested against silk. Icons shone through incense. Priests spoke of blessing, order, and divine favor. The palace became a theater of holiness so overwhelming that almost no one looking at it would think to ask what had been required before this moment could appear so perfect. That was the point. The ceremony did not erase the hidden process. It concealed it. Everything about imperial marriage was designed to make political necessity look eternal, sacred, and beautiful. The bride seemed elevated above ordinary womanhood. She seemed chosen, almost untouchable, as if grace itself had reached down and placed her beside the throne. But what the empire presented as honor also functioned as conversion. A daughter became an imperial body. A woman became a dynastic symbol. A private self disappeared beneath ritual. The hymns suggested union. The crown suggested glory. The public image suggested that a fortunate woman had been lifted into unimaginable privilege. And in one sense, she had. No one could deny the splendor. No one could deny the astonishing force of the image. But splendor is not freedom, and elevation is not the same thing as safety. Because once the ceremony was complete, the bride no longer belonged to the life she had come from. She belonged to the system that had dressed her in sanctity. From that point on, her face, her conduct, her fertility, her piety, even her silence would carry political meaning. The palace would read everything. A gesture could become rumor. A delay could become anxiety. A pregnancy could become relief, danger, or both at once. The wedding did not release her into a higher life. It sealed her inside a more magnificent form of obligation. That is what makes the image so haunting. The beauty is real. The holiness is real. But they are serving something colder underneath. Byzantium understood that power appears strongest when it no longer looks like force, when control arrives wrapped in incense and song, when surveillance takes the shape of etiquette, when biological urgency is hidden beneath jewels, when a young woman can be absorbed into the machinery of succession while the world calls the process blessed. So the wedding was never just a celebration. It was a mask, a sacred mask placed over dynasty, pressure, expectation, and fear. And the bride, shining in gold before the empire, was not simply being adored. She was being installed. If the story ended at the wedding, history could keep pretending this was a tale of elevation. But the real test began after the crown. Once an imperial bride entered the palace as wife, she ceased to be a beautiful possibility and became a permanent object of interpretation. Nothing about her was private anymore. Not her schedule, not her alliances, not her health, not her moods, not the condition of her body, not the terrifying question that would soon hover over everything she did. Would she produce an heir? This is where the splendor hardened into pressure, because an empress was never allowed to exist as a woman alone. She existed as a wife, a symbol, a vessel of continuity, a point around which rival interests could gather. If she conceived, the palace watched. If she did not, the palace still watched. Delay became anxiety. Miscarriage could become whispered blame. Childbirth could raise her standing or expose her to new danger. Even success was not simple. A woman who produced the future of the dynasty gained importance, but importance inside a suspicious court could become another form of danger. And surveillance did not always need to announce itself. It lived in attendance, in corridors, in ritual visits, in the reports carried quietly between rooms, in the way factions read meaning into every favor and every silence. A glance toward the wrong person could become rumor. Warmth shown to one relative could be interpreted as ambition. Piety could be sincere, but it could also be judged as performance. Distance could look like dignity or contempt. In such a world, a bride did not merely live inside the palace. She lived inside interpretation. That is what made Byzantine magnificence so dangerous to the women trapped within it. The court did not always have to break a woman openly. It could narrow her instead, reduce her choices, surround her with expectation until every path felt supervised. If she pleased the system, she was praised as serene, holy, and worthy. If she failed it, the language darkened. She could become disappointing, unstable, inconvenient, barren, politically damaging, or suddenly unworthy of the light once placed upon her. And then came the final cruelty. History would still remember the ceremony, the mosaics, the silk, the pearls, the sacred glow. It would remember the image the empire wanted, not the quieter life that followed, not the fear of failing in a palace where failure was never entirely personal, not the exhaustion of being watched for signs of usefulness, not the humiliating truth that beneath all the holiness, an imperial bride had been chosen partly because her body could be recruited into the future of the state. That is the hidden truth history leaves out. The Byzantine imperial bride did not simply rise. She was selected, corrected, sanctified, and enclosed. The crown did not free her from ordinary life. It placed her inside a more beautiful form of control. And that is why the image still works so well. Because even now, when we look at the gold, the candles, the icons, and the perfect stillness of imperial art, we are tempted to see transcendence. But the palace was not showing transcendence. It was showing discipline made luminous. A young woman stands beside the throne, glittering in sacred light, and the empire calls her blessed. What it means is that she has been made useful. What it means is that the ceremony succeeded. What it means is that the cage was magnificent enough to be mistaken for glory.